Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Wilmington, Delaware. I want to say welcome to all of our ambassadors from the European Union who are here with us today, along with two of my favorite people. To my left, Congresswoman. To my left, Sarah, you're a senator, right? Yeah. So to my sister in the state Senate, amen. We praise God for your being with us to discuss a very, very important matter around race, gender, equality, justice, and so forth. If this sanctuary looks familiar to anyone who's live streaming, this is the very spot. In fact, candidate Joseph Biden sat right where I'm sitting now, and I sat where Senator Mcbride is sitting as we came to discuss Delaware's response to the George Floyd murder. And he called me up and said, I need a space for to come and have a meeting with community leaders, and clergy, so on and so forth. And he said that Bethel is the place that I like to come. And I was honored by that. But it also said to me immediately that the then candidate, who is now our president, had the sense to know that the church is more than a place where you come and do a photo op with a Bible upside down. Okay, because somebody else did, another candidate did that during that period. But that he could come into the church and be in a safe and a sacred space to talk about race, to talk about justice, to talk about equality. And that's still an issue in America. It's an issue for African Americans, for minorities across the board, for the LGBTQ plus community, and so forth. And I'm going to finish my introduction, or welcome an introduction, by saying this, and it's about gender. Every morning I wake up to watch ESPN, and I'm usually up about 4:30 in the morning, every morning. Now, I didn't hear who won the WNBA title, but I soon found out in the intro of SportsCenter that it was the team that I wanted to win, Chicago Sky. And they ran a little primo. And then I told my wife, I'm not going to get up until I can see this story because I don't want to miss any of it. And so I sat there, and the first thing that came up was the NFL, the NFL, the NFL. It was almost a half hour before they said anything about the WNBA. And I told my wife, if this had been the NBA Finals, they would have led off with that story. I find that to be gender bias. I find it to be insensitive, disrespectful, that the WNBA title was won by a team that nobody said could win it. And that would not be the lead story. To me, my brothers and sisters, that says a lot about at least gender, and I can go on and on about race and other social injustices. So welcome. I hope that we're going to have a fruitful discussion.
There we go. Can folks hear me? There we go. Well, good afternoon. My name's Sarah Mcbride. I'm the state senator for Delaware's 1st State Senate District. And I am so excited to be here with so many incredible leaders, both from the great state of Delaware, but also, of course, from the European Union and its member states. And we're going to have a really important conversation between both representatives from the United States and representatives from the European Union. But before that, I would like to turn things over to our esteemed Congresswoman, Lisa Blunt Rochester, for a few remarks.
Thank you so much to Senator Sarah Mcbride. We want to make sure that we give you your due. It is also always, always, always an honor to be with now Bishop Beeman and in this great edifice. It's great to be at Bethel, the place where so many powerful, important movements have happened, as well as the conversation that Pastor Beeman mentioned with the president, now president. And I remember him standing here. I remember after George Floyd's death, there was such a heaviness in our country. And the fact that it was during a pandemic and people were home and they were watching this over almost 9 minutes, of a knee on a man's neck, if there was this heaviness and there was a void in our country of leadership at that moment. And I remember talking to then Vice President Biden and also folks in his circle, and he asked, what is happening in Wilmington, our home city? And we then he got me in the car and said, let's go to this meeting that Pastor Beeman, IMAC, we have a ministers' council in Delaware, and it was almost a full circle moment from him deciding to run after Charlottesville and seeing swastikas and seeing torches and seeing hate on display and him wanting to focus on the soul of America. And so I think it's apropos that we would be here in this important place as we talk about not just the soul of America, but of the world. And to me, these issues of race, of gender, of class, all of the isms really are tied to equity, justice, and ultimately love, because that's really what it's all about. Because when you love people, you don't want to see them hungry, you don't want to see them discriminated against, you don't want to see them homeless. It's about love. And so I'm really pleased to be here representing our Senators Tom Carper, Senator Coons, myself as our representative, and also just to say to the leadership, I know Ambassador Lambrinides will maybe introduce the delegation, but I want to say how pleased I was to be able to be this morning with members of the EU delegation, with our president of our HBCU here in Delaware, our historically black college, and beyond, just one of the most stellar universities right now in the country, with President Tony Allen. Please, I want to make sure we give a little bit of clap. And if you're out there, show the Hornets some love. Thank you so much. It's okay. I think it's okay. Oh. I think it's okay to clap and just to say what a great session we had this morning, talking about threats to democracy and also talking about our shared values, our joint connection, and that in this world, we're not isolated. We are connected, whether it's a pandemic that knows no borders or whether it's dealing with issues of making sure that democracies across the world are strong and vibrant. So I am pleased to be here with the senator, with the delegation, with I don't call him bishop, I call him pastor, because he's my pastor, Pastor Beeman, as well as Tony Allen, Ms. Kelly from the University of Delaware, and all of you that are watching from the live stream. Thank you, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman and Bishop Beeman. We are also, I think, so lucky, as the Congresswoman said, to be in this historic place with you. There are, I think, 3 Delawareans that wherever you go, everyone knows their name. Well, 4 if you count Joe Biden. One is the Congresswoman, one is Bishop Beeman, and the next person is a leader who has done so many things throughout our state and has really helped to transform Delaware in a way that lifts everyone up. And so it's my pleasure to now actually introduce my friend, the president of Delaware State University, an esteemed historically black college university, Dr. Tony Allen.
Good evening. I want to say a few things. First off, Bishop, I know I haven't said it to you directly in person because of COVID, but couldn't be more proud of you. Could not be more proud of you, what you represent always, and this new elevation, which I know is divine and destined. So thank you for all you do. To those out here, I'm home today. This is my home church. Pastor doesn't let me forget that, even though I live in Dover. So it's always good to be home. And certainly Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, who was fantastic today. She's normally fantastic, but she was super fantastic today with your colleagues at Delaware State University with about 200 students looking on. So thank you for that opportunity. And then to my good friend, Senator Mcbride, also my state senator, actually. It's been exceptional to watch you and what you have represented for us in a real responsible way. I'm proud to be the president of Delaware State University for two reasons. In the fall of 2017, I was provost, chief academic officer, and a young man came into my office, and he was shy. He was from Wilmington, and he was a sophomore at the university. And he didn't know what to tell me or how to tell me, but after about 30 minutes of trying to pry it out of him, he told me he was homeless. He's a sophomore at Delaware State University, homeless. I said, how long have you been homeless? He said, since he was a sophomore in high school. So I thought first, think about the grit it takes to be a sophomore in high school, get yourself out of high school, then get in college before you ever ask a soul for help. I'm proud to say we got him housing. He became my intern. He graduated from Delaware State University and is now a public school teacher in inner city Baltimore. I say that because regardless of the inequities in our system, young people in particular have real grit, have what it takes to get to the finish line. But we need to be thoughtful about that, and we need to always be opening doors. Sometimes those doors are in the U.S., but more and more, they should be open across the globe, which is why we're so glad that all of you are here. Second, before Congresswoman Blunt Rochester came to speak to our students today, Delaware State University signed a historic memorandum of understanding with USAID. We are the first HBCU in the country ever to do that. And that is about being more globally connected. So as I said to the ambassador, this is not the end of the day. This is the beginning of a new day, of a new connection. So we are proud to have you all here, looking forward to working with you, and thank you for everything you do.
Thank you so much, President Allen. And now we're going to dive in to this conversation about human rights, equality, and our shared democratic values as an EU, as its EU member states, and as a country here in the United States. And I think this conversation is so fitting, as the Congresswoman said, because we are having it in this incredibly historic church with an incredibly powerful leader here in Bishop Beeman, a place that has not just been at the forefront of the fight for racial justice, but a place that is truly a safe space for all people here in Delaware. You have been advocates for a gender-inclusive society, for LGBTQ people, for people living with HIV. And so it is fitting that we have this conversation at a space that is truly safe for everyone in our Delaware community. And it's fitting that we have this conversation at a point that is, at minimum, an inflection point, and if not a full crisis for human rights and for democratic values here in the United States, in the EU, and around the world. And so I'd like to begin with really sort of setting the scene for all of us to understand what are the circumstances in our respective communities and countries. And joining the Congresswoman, President Allen, Bishop Beeman, and I is first, of course, the one who has corralled all of the EU member state ambassadors, EU Ambassador Lambrinidis. We have Ambassador Regibo from Belgium and Ambassador Azzopardi from Malta. And we are incredibly lucky to be in the presence of the three of you today. And so, Ambassador Lambrinides, I'd like to start with you, because right now, as we have seen here in the United States, and certainly as we are seeing in the EU and many member states, there is a rise in nationalist and populist movements. We've seen xenophobia, we've seen anti-LGBTQ prejudice, in many cases, not just in rhetoric, but in policy, increasing in some aspects of Europe and throughout many Western democracies. And so I'd like to begin with you with this sort of broad question of your perspective on the status of pluralism and an open society within the EU.
I'll take this. This works? Maybe? I have to press the button? Brilliant. I got it. Thank you so much, and it's fantastic to be here, Bishop Beeman. I'm sure that you'll be leaving this church with a tremendous amount of pride in your heart for what you have created and the people you have inspired, and South Africa is just way too lucky to have you, but that's a good thing. And I have to say, when it comes to me as a European ambassador here in this country, I know that there is a long and proud history of advancing civil liberties and human rights, seeking greater equality for all Americans, and I know that the church has been at the forefront of this battle. And I can tell you, because I heard it mentioned, that perhaps if anything shocked us in Europe as much as it did you in the States, was that picture of that knee on George Floyd's neck. It was a wake-up call for every one of us as well in Europe. Racism is not gone. It is around. It is in this country. We have it in Europe. And although Americans and Europeans perhaps have made the largest strides in terms of dealing with this scourge, we have to keep doing more, because hatred is climbing up. It's climbing up. And when hatred climbs up, and in addition to hatred, I should say fear. Sometimes it is the fear of the other person, very often because I am not quite sure who I am myself. And that makes me much less open to interacting with others, just because I'm afraid they may affect me too much. That kind of fear can be as insidious as outright hatred in the way that you are able to approach someone else. So we are dealing with those issues in Europe. The financial crisis that we had 10 years ago increased tremendously the sense of fear, uncertainty in our societies. What's going to happen to my job next day? Who may come to take it or who may not? There are a lot of people who try to pedal into those, muddy waters, and it's not that difficult. And we had some political parties even in Europe that came out of that swamp that were very racist, very xenophobic. But you know what? 10 years later, they haven't disappeared. But they're not really quite there anymore. And the reason is, I think, twofold. One thing is, we actually stood up and look at the problem in the eye, and we didn't shy away from taking very strong legislative and other measures to stop the spread of that hate speech at its inception. And this is something that we perhaps disagree if you look at the legal systems, the American and the European one. In Europe, we have determined that speech that is intended to incite to violence against someone is illegal, right? You, because of First Amendment and other issues, have not crossed that line quite yet. But speech can break bones as much as a punch in the face can. But of course, we all defend free speech religiously in both our continents. Where do you draw the line? It's never easy and it's never simple. But you have to make a decision that there are some things that are simply too poisonous to be able to allow to be out there. We've seen that, and we all kind of agree when this happens in the context of the internet, which can take something and multiply it so much that suddenly any democracy can be shaken, because democracy is the toughest political system in the world. It's much tougher than authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is easy. I'm a man, it's usually a man, strong-armed. I make decisions. If you don't like those decisions, you're in jail or maybe dead, and I move ahead. Democracy requires every single citizen to have the power to learn the facts, debate with the other, understand, hold a government into account, And if you have hatred and fear and division, this whole process collapses. Can't happen, right? So we have to deal, and what we're dealing in Europe a lot now is with that, with the root causes of that kind of fear and hatred. And we're also very active around the world, because a lot of that, as much as we are frustrated what's happening in our societies, guys, go visit other countries. For 7 years before this job, I used to run the human rights of the European Union. And I'll tell you just one thing, because we're talking about gender equality, more to say later. I would go to countries around the world where women were treated in the worst possible way. No rights given, no education given, violence against women in the home or outside, and no laws to stop it, or if there were laws, no police to enforce it. And I would go and I would say, this is a real issue, guys. Let's talk about it, because we Europeans, on this at least, we're quite advanced. Let's discuss. And the answer I would get was, why are you raising these issues, Mr. Lambrinidis? I mean, we have so many important stuff to deal with here. Terrorism, usually it was terrorism and violence and all that, organized crime. We have to deal with all these things, and you're poisoning this discussion with raising, all these issues with women. And my answer to that always was, I would answer to their question, why human rights, with another question. My question was, what's so scary about smart girls? So you tell me, why did in Pakistan the Taliban plant a bullet in Malala Yousafzai's head a few years back, a young girl advocating for girls' education? You tell me why in Nigeria Boko Haram went ahead and abducted 300 girls from school instead of going ahead and just bombing one more army barracks that they're good at. And you tell me why in Iraq ISIS was abducting, killing, forcefully marrying Yazidi girls. What's so scary about smart girls? And if you think about it, smart girls become educated girls become empowered women change entirely the balance of power in any society, and the last thing a terrorist wants is empowered society. So they want societies with big black holes of power they can fill in with their hatred. So you want to fight terrorism, educate girls. Educate girls and boys and boys and boys. But educate girls. Don't tell me that human rights is some kind of pie-in-the-sky thing that a bunch of Europeans are going around advocating. It is real hard policy, and Americans and Europeans together, because our values are there together, because our strength is there together, and because when we backslide, and boy do we, when we backslide, we have free individuals, watchdogs in our society, like Bishop Beeman, like so many on this panel, that will stop us. They will keep our feet to the coal without being thrown in jail for doing so. I am hopeful that if we work together on human rights, we'll be better in our societies, the world will be better. And that's what I'm fighting for, honestly.
Well, thank you for taking us to church on that. That was fantastic. And you actually anticipated most of my questions. So we're going to dive deeper. No. We're going to dive deeper in pretty much everything you just spoke to. But I'd like to go to Ambassador Regibo from Belgium for his thoughts, again, to sort of set the table for all of us in this conversation around the status and health of pluralism and open society and basic human rights within Belgium, but also within the European Union from your perspective.
Well, thank you so much, first, for being privileged enough to be together with you today. I think that when we discuss this type of issues, we have to remember first that democracy is not just about voting. It's much more than that. It's about how we look at daily life and how we respect each other. Second, to pursue what Stavros already said, we're fully aware that physical violence always starts with verbal violence. And to some extent, we are quite proud of Belgium being a very diverse society, but a very low level of violence, including in the political field, where we have sometimes really heated debates, because we have two main linguistic communities, the one speaking Dutch, the other one speaking French. And these debates can last for 10 years, 20 years, but we never have a single victim of this debate. And indeed, we might consider ourselves happy to be able to almost always find a compromise so that we can still live together. First, third point, I would like to quote your president when he said that the job is to lead by example. And then there is a message not just in domestic politics, but also international politics. I think the best way we can serve our values, democracy, human rights, is by showing what it produces in our own country. Because even authoritarian dictators could say that we are worth nothing. Actually, the opposite is true. Because even if they want to discard us, we know that their population is not discarding us, and actually, secretly, if it's necessary, longing for the same experience of life. Another point, and I understand that sometimes it's difficult, because I have 4 years of experience in Russia, which is not always an example in terms of human rights. But to enter into a dialogue with people who do not share your values, I think it's very important to show that first you want to listen to the other side. I think that you do not defend your own identity by destroying the identity on the other side. I think that we have to prove, and sometimes because we feel that our values are really worth it, we have to be the first one to show respect in terms of dialogue. And then my experience that when you have this respect for the other side, they are much more interested in listening to you. Even so, if we might not agree on everything, that the start of a dialogue is very important. I will conclude by saying that we have the feeling that beyond Belgium, beyond the European Union, we face similar challenges. And that's why we're so happy not just to discuss about it, but also to lead common and joint action with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to turn to Ambassador Azzopardi to share your perspective on the health of pluralism and open society right now in the European Union and globally.
Well, first of all, thank you for welcoming us, and it's good to be the last speaker among my colleagues because I have only things to add, nothing new to say. But I would like to stress two points, which I think, in my opinion at least, it's quite realistic. Sometimes, at least in many parts of the world, we tend to look at human rights and the issue of equality as some kind of cherry-picking menu, whereby we advocate and we stand up for human rights when it suits us, and we tend to turn our faces when, you know, we don't like it or it doesn't interest us. Earlier last week, not earlier this week, I witnessed myself with my own eyes a surprising incident, you know, downtown DC, where you know, a black guy was simply riding a bike, and a white guy came from the back and hit him. And, you know, it could have been the other way around. I mean, it's wrong, nevertheless. But if it was the other way around, most likely, the reaction would have been different. And therefore, it's a moral obligation. It's not because human rights are law or because, you know, they're enshrined in our constitution or our charters. It is a moral obligation that we stand up, you know, and we don't take for granted the fact that we should enjoy human rights. The second thing I would like to stress is that you are rightly so concerned about, you know, maybe the inequalities which exist or the civil arrests at times here. But I can assure you that this is not a problem which is confined only to the state of Delaware or the United States. Unfortunately, as the EU ambassador has said before me, even in Europe, we have been witnessing, you know, unfortunate rise when it comes to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and you name it. And the question is, even us as Europeans, are we doing enough? The good thing about being part of the European Union, because let's face it, governments are elected every 5 years in most of our countries, and governments change, and some governments are more proactive than others. The good thing is that we are part of this union, which is composed, is made up of mainly three big institutions, the Council, the Commission, and the European Parliament. And I mentioned the European Commission in particular for the fact that besides it's the institution which shapes the way forward of the Union, it's also, above all, the guardian of our treaty. And even when we as member states, we don't do enough to combat these inequalities, these breaches of human rights, we always get a tap on our shoulders. Not just the European Commission. Ambassador Lambrinidis and I, we come from the European Parliament. Even the European Parliament recently is pushing to also constrain member states from getting certain funds if they do not fulfill the legal obligations and uphold the basic and fundamental principles for which we are supposed to stand for, being part of the European Union. So what I want to say is that whether it's the state of Delaware, whether the United States in general or Europe, human rights and these kind of inequalities are not a problem of an individual place or destination. It's a global problem which necessitates a global response. And we are so happy to see, I must say, a revival or a strengthening of this transatlantic relationship between the United States and Europe. And we need to stay strong together. We are the two regions which, our democratic societies are based on the fundamental principles of democracy and the rule of law. And if we are not the ones who work together, who stand side by side together, who else would fight in order to combat this kind of discrimination anywhere in the world, not just in Europe or the United States? I come from the smallest country in the European Union, and we are not perfect either. 4 years ago, we had the most terrible news when a prominent local journalist was brutally killed. And the whole country was shocked. The whole country was shocked. And we're still seeking justice for that, and rightly so. The European Union, which we form part of, puts a lot of pressure on us in order to seek justice. So these problems are not confined to one place or to another, whether you're small, whether you're big. And it is important more than ever, especially when we're witnessing this rise of discrimination and hatred, all around the world, more than ever to stand side by side as Europeans and Americans. We should not look at faces, and we should never hesitate to stand up for what is right. I don't think that should be a difficult task, but it seems to be.
Well, thank you so much for that, and I think you provided a good segue in just a second to a question that I want to ask about those global forces for this global problem. But before we get there, I do want to turn to some of my American colleagues, because we've talked about the recent history in this very space of then former Vice President Joe Biden standing here in the midst of that historic call for racial justice that we saw in May and June of 2020, one that we continue to hear and we must continue to heed. But Reverend Beeman and President Allen, I'd love your thoughts now, a year and a half almost since that particular inflection point. What progress do you feel like we've seen? And where do you feel like we've fallen short of meeting the moment?
I feel that it is important that we are at least standing up and identifying this ongoing problem and the issue about race. And I've been saying to my colleagues and preaching from this pulpit that the scourge of poverty in the African American community is as violent as any overt racist remark or racist or injustice. That's one. Number two, we are not playing on the same field or card or board. On my way here, there was a truck, and I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. There was a truck parked right in front of my house. My granddaughter was getting off the bus, going to let herself in. I pulled up beside the car on the opposite road and said, "Can I help you?" And his look at me was like, "How dare you?" I said, "I live there, and I wanted to know, why are you parked in front of my house for the last 5 or 10 minutes doing nothing?" Now, let's just change that. Let's change that that's an African American or minority parked in front of an upscale neighborhood for 5 or 10 minutes, and a white neighbor or homeowner said to the African American, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I'm on my cell phone." And I called the police. What would be the reaction from the police department to come to that neighborhood where a non-white person parked in front of someone's resident that long? Well, we all know the answer to that. And so that is still an ongoing problem in America. Being black, riding your bike, and you get assaulted. I can go on, but I think my answer is that we are at least standing up and having a qualitative conversation, and we're doing the right things from a protest perspective that is kicking the can and moving the needle, so that people like yourselves who are in office can try to enact laws that will result in justice and equality.
President Allen, your thoughts?
Senator, I'd say two things. One, I'm quite hopeful with the young people and how they have come to the fore. And I can tell you that after I was here too, when the then candidate Biden was here, right after the George Floyd incident. And then about 2 weeks after that, all of us were having ongoing conversations with folks much younger than us, angry, who wanted a lot of us to step out of the way so they could show up. And I started saying to myself, my responsibility to those young people is to show up and shut up and let them lead the way. And I think you all saw the protest, the thoughtful protest that ensued with real goals, lots of which were accomplished. So that was a real lesson for me. The second lesson was, right after the incident, my Student Government Association did a video teleconference with me. They were newly elected. They said, "President Allen, we want 3 things when we get back. 1, we want a Black Lives Matter Boulevard on campus. 2, we want you to review your entire supplier vendor organizations and make sure that all of those vendors their mission and core values line up with Delaware State University. And 3, we want to have an ongoing interaction with the university police on our campus. So what is happening in our communities doesn't happen in our university. I'm proud to say all 3 of those things got done. And it was really because they kept at it. It wasn't a one time and done. They were the ones that designed our Black Lives Matter Boulevard. They helped us review every supplier, and all of our suppliers did not make it through that process. And they engaged with the university police throughout the year as a proxy for what was happening in their community. So I say what I've learned is sometimes we got to listen, show up, and shut up, and watch our young people like they've always done historically, help lead us through these particular moments.
Absolutely. Young people certainly have been at the forefront of these movements. I think a young John Lewis leading the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge is a powerful reminder. Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, Ambassador Lambrinides talked about the importance of empowering women in the context not just of human rights, but in a flourishing small L liberal society. Right now, there are a number of major conversations around gender that we are having as a country. One is in the aftermath of the Texas bill around abortion. But 2, a positive conversation, I think, is the conversation that you have been really at the center of with the President's Build Back Better agenda that has put a particular focus on making sure that our economy better works and better supports women, and particularly women of color. And so I'd love to hear your perspective of where we are here in the States and what you are working on to try to address equity and justice in the gender context.
Well, thank you, Senator, and especially thank you for your leadership here in Delaware for issues like FMLA. I think we have to give credit. It's not just what happens in Washington, D.C., but it's what happens at the local level and happens a lot more quickly than at the federal level. So,
hopefully.
Yes. Well, I do want to touch a little bit on the question that you asked about where haven't we made the progress and where have we? Because I think that there is still great work to do. The president, he came here, but he hearkened back to 1969, 1968. This is not the first time that as a country we have struggled with issues of race and class and gender. It's not the first time, but for him to come back and say when he got elected that I'm going to have a whole of government review of equity. Like, we know because of the pandemic that there were structural and institutional racism, sexism, like we could go through all of that. And for him to do that is important. And while there are things that I feel still, we have not passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act in Congress yet. We passed it in the House, and now we are waiting for the Senate. Voting rights. When we talked about democracy earlier, that is one of the cornerstones, if not the cornerstone, of participation and people being able to vote. This week, it looks like we're seeing movement in the Senate. That's a positive thing. But there's still so much to be done, and I really agree with Pastor Beeman on the poverty issue. To me, again, the fact that during the pandemic, we were able to come together and cut childhood poverty in half in this country is a big step. The fact that even during the pandemic, we were able to do things like sick time and paid leave, things that impact so many women in this country, and that European countries have been doing for decades, is not new. My son was born in France, so I know this. There are changes that are happening, and I also want to highlight the fact that, and this ties to your question about women, and one of the reasons why I'm pushing and supportive of the president's Build Back Better agenda, because there are 2 parts to it. One is our roads, our bridges, our ports, our rail, and broadband infrastructure. That is a necessity, not only if we're going to have a quality of life, but even just to compete. That must be done, and there's agreement that will be done. The other part is that human infrastructure. And what we know is that In the construction area, 90% of those jobs, y'all know I was Secretary of Labor here in Delaware, so I look at jobs. Jobs is my thing. But 90% are men in the construction profession. But on the human infrastructure, when you look at childcare, pre-K, things like that, those are predominantly women and women of color. When we look at issues of equity, even the most recent CDC report that came out saying that 1 in 500 children in this country has a parent or caregiver who has died due to COVID. 1 in 500, and of them, 70% are children of color. So that's why this work is so important, and what gives me hope is to see the representation that shows up at the ballot box, that participates, but also that runs for office. Sarah made history when she ran. I made history when I ran. And to see Medina and others, Muslim, the LGBTQ, plus the first black and woman to be in Congress, that gives me hope that we have to just keep doing our part. I love what everyone has said, and I could talk about everything everyone has said, but I do want to say that we have to, like you said, make sure that women, girls, and boys, but in many countries, the challenge is girls getting that opportunity. And so making sure that we lift all boats, that's the goal.
So a number of the answers have touched on the fact that this is a global problem, right? There are global forces, and beyond the individual circumstances in our country, beyond the fact that the legacy of slavery and race is truly the through line in American history, regardless of the unique dynamics in the European Union and the financial crisis and the migration phenomenon that you all saw in the 2010s. Despite all of those sort of nation or region-specific dynamics, this is clearly happening not just intercontinentally, but globally, right? I mean, we can look at Brazil, we can look at a number of other countries that have seen some level of crisis in democratic institutions and human rights. And really that democratic institution part I want to pull the thread on a little bit, because none of the rights that we have talked about are possible, achievable, or reality if we don't have the fundamental right to self-determination within our governments and our communities. And so I'd love to hear, particularly from our ambassadors, your thoughts about what are those forces that are at play right now, whether it's the financial crisis, globalization, new technology. What are the forces that are creating this global tide that we are combating right now when it comes to the rise of nationalist and populist movements? So, Ambassador, yeah.
So, look, I think there's no question that economic inequality and the sense in the past several years that the gap between the haves and the have-nots has increased. There's no question that it has played a huge role. And I think that we, as open market democracies, fail to see how globalization would affect so many parts of our communities. And that's our bad, right? So, I mean, many people had the facts, but were just too high on the notion that, we thought all the boats would rise, as you said, but they didn't, right? Now, that's a big thing. It got a lot of people to feel that the system doesn't work, the system. When you start from that, what is the system? Well, my congresswoman, the Congress doesn't work. Well, the press doesn't work. That's the system. These are the pillars of a democracy. So if I feel I'm in a democracy and things are not working for me, I'm going to be looking around and trying to shoot down all those things. That is what makes us fundamentally different from a dictatorship, right? And I'm not necessarily going to say a dictatorship is great. In fact, at the same time, I will say I hate dictatorship. But I don't understand in my head that if my hatred starts undermining everything that democracy is about, that's where I'm going to end up myself one day, okay? So inequality, I think, is a big thing, and we didn't catch it. There are many other things. I agree with Jean Arthur, the Bethel ambassador. Look, human rights is law. It's law. It tells you what you can or cannot do. And law usually does not tell you how you should or should not feel. And at some point, I think those who did human rights on our side became too aggressive in conflating the two notions, feelings and actions. And suddenly it became not okay for me to feel bad or to feel uncomfortable with someone who's not like me. But in fact, it's okay to feel those things. A part of humanity coming and rubbing itself against each other is that, you know, we're trying to figure each other out. We're not the same. You know, I may see you, you may scare me a little bit at the beginning, I'll have to figure it out, it's a discussion. If you tell me I can't feel that I don't like a particular person for something or other, you're forcing me to become, in a sense, radicalized in my prejudice. I can tell you, you cannot kick someone because they are black, or because they're Greek, or because they're a woman, or because they're gay. That's an action. You cannot speak words that will incite violence against that person. That's an action. But your feelings, as Jean Arthur said, I have to understand them. I have discussed them. The final thing I would say when it comes to looking around the world, what I've always found very effective telling people, so many times people will come and say, why are you talking about this? You know, look at the polling in our society. You know, 80% don't like gays. 90% don't like, that color of skin or the other color. You know, my answer is, you know what, human rights, for better or for worse, they're not for the popular. I mean, one thing, take freedom of expression or speech. No one associates that with race or with gender. If everyone agreed in this room, would anyone have come up and thought, oh, you know, we need to put in every one of our constitutions a provision to protect freedom of speech? No, we all agree, right? We hold hands, we have it, we sing. It's all fine. It is when you disagree with someone, and when you disagree strongly with someone, and when one of the two has the power to silence the other, that's when you need freedom of speech provision. So in other words, even freedom of speech is there to protect the unpopular speech. But you know what? At one point or another in our lives, we are all unpopular. We are all minorities. We are all minorities. You're in a room where the majority are men, and they say, well, you know what? I'm going to pass all these laws against women because I'm a man, and I think a woman should be just at home, and she shouldn't be educated and stuff. Okay, so I'm a majority, right? At the same moment in that majority that you're the majority because you're a man, you're most likely a minority because of your religion, maybe, because the color of your skin, because you have a sexual orientation. And the moment you open up the door to hell, which is justifying discrimination against people that you don't like, or that they are not like you, is the moment that you turn the gun to your head. And that is something that we have to understand. Love, you said before. I absolutely agree. It is what Europe was built on. People here, people listening to us, most people probably don't even know what the European Union is, honestly. But the fact is that we are 27 countries, some of the countries that you've heard of, some you may not have heard of, who came out of the Second World War when we were killing each other, guys. We were killing each other. It was the bloodiest war in recent history, and Europeans were killing each other. And we came out of that and we said, that's what hatred does. No matter what else happens in Europe, we're not going to get there again. We're going to do everything possible to ensure that love prevails. And 80 years later, Europe is the most peaceful continent in the world, the most prosperous, biggest market in the world, an area where women's rights and minority rights are being protected, although we backslide sometimes. If you work from love, you can do amazing things. And I'm sorry if this sounds too soft and too cute, but, you know, I've never felt that love is a soft thing. I felt it's the toughest thing. You know what's easy to do? It's hate. Oh, hate is so easy. And I love those people hating, thinking they're actually tough guys. Look at me. I hate. I'm going to fight against you. You're not tough. It's not tough. It's not tough to take the majority position and go around and hate someone else. The tough thing is to love and to make others love. If you can do that, I tip my hat to you.
So speak in my language. That's my language.
So, building off of that, and I want to ask Ambassador as a party and Ambassador Regibo. Ambassador Lambrinidis mentioned that post-World War II sort of consensus that developed and the reforms that ensued that facilitated 50 years, 60 years of peace, of a fairly linear growth of human rights and human acceptance. But to the degree that there are, in the European Union, I would argue anti-democratic reforms we're seeing in Hungary and in Poland, which the European Union has taken important steps to combat the anti-LGBTQ laws that have put in place, at least at the local level in Poland. Here in the United States, January 6th, which I know the Congresswoman spoke about passionately beforehand, the attempt to overturn an election to nullify the votes of predominantly women, people of color. There's no question that while it might not be at its height, maybe it was 5 or 10 years ago, that there are these persistent efforts to undermine human rights and democracy. And that the previous point, 60, 70 years ago, where we helped to solidify that was a moment of reform. And so I'm curious, as we face these challenges, in addition to the strategy of love, what are some reforms that we need in our systems or in our values to help protect these democratic institutions and help to protect human rights? So, Ambassador Azzopardi?
Well, I think Ambassador Lambrinidis made a very, very important point, because whenever we talk about the European Union nowadays, most of the time we talk about trade, commerce, space, you name it. But the main motive why countries came together and eventually more countries joined to form what we know as the European Union is to make sure that Europe lives in peace. And I strongly believe that nobody on this planet is born knowing how to hate. We learn how to hate. I have a 6-year-old daughter. She goes to an international school, right? Her classmates, they come from different countries, different colors. I don't recall that she ever came to me and she told me, listen, that yellow guy or that black guy, she doesn't know the difference. Of course, people look different. Even twins look different, So the bottom line is that we as human beings are taught how to hate. So this is the starting point where we all have to start from. Yes, the European Union is no less different than the United States. We have our fair share of challenges, as you rightly said, and as I mentioned before. And I think the issue of human rights, discrimination, and so on and so forth, it's not something that we take for granted simply because there are charters or there are laws or because we have guardians, looking at us to see what we're doing. This is a continuous battle, and even though we get reprimanded or we get punished at times for not following these laws, I think unless it comes from, it boils down to the individual, but the state has a responsibility to lead by example. Now, the truth is that bad things resonate more in life. I mean, we open the TV, we watch the news, all we hear is about killing and racial hatred and wars and so on and so forth. But the truth is, and I genuinely believe that the absolute majority of human beings on this planet are good people. And yes, we do have to increase our efforts to protect human rights, to fight inequalities, whether, it's based on gender or sexual orientation or you name it. But in my opinion, it's as important as to empower these good people in our societies. Because these are the people who are leading by example. I mean, we see young kids, they know nothing, they're innocent. But then you go to some places, and, it happened to me, even in my own country. I'm not pinpointing fingers at others, and I'm shocked by the language. We are a small country, and we are faced with, it is a problem, but a social problem, I call it, of immigration. We don't build walls because we're an island, but even this issue, the way I look at it, while yes, there are concerns about security, economic impact, and you name it, we cannot tend to forget that it's also a humanitarian issue. So when I see someone, and especially a young person, calling names at these people who are desperate to leave their country, to find a safer haven, where they can give a future to their children, that worries me a lot. And I'm not talking just about immigration. We're talking about, justice, discrimination when it comes to women. We should not look at women because of the way they look or because of the way they dress, or any other form of social injustice which we face in every country. So to end what I started from, I think, yes, we do have to talk about current challenges, and yes, phenomena like the current pandemic have increased these social problems in many parts of the world. But we should never forget that there are still a lot of good people who are willing to join and to stand up. And it's as important to give these people, many in our society, maybe in this church or at the social club outside this building or at the supermarket, whatever. I've also witnessed people standing up for others while I was doing my shopping with my wife. Something which I was not expecting. But yes, there are people. So to end this, I truly believe that it is important to stand together, irrespective of whether we are Europeans or Americans or Africans, not just to find these inequalities and discrimination, but also to empower good people around us,
Sir.
who would be leading figures and examples to future generations.
Can I just add very quickly to the conversation, because as the member of the God Squad up here, when I hear words like love and hate, I immediately see them through my theological and spiritual prism. And immediately also come to my mind is Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Actually, Dietrich Bonhoeffer came to my mind first, because the feelings which the clergy, we traffic in feelings. People, religion is about feelings first. And here recently we have seen feelings being weaponized by despots and by clerics, by preachers in America as well as in Europe. And we need to bring back to the fore religion as our sacred books truly talk about them, and not the despots who take the sacred scripture and twist it and turn it to deal with those people who are really afraid. And that's the reason why their feelings get weaponized, because the people who are doing the psychological job is able to capture their feelings and their fear. And we just really need for the church and the spiritual and the faith community to really stand up and try to move the needle on justice and equality across the globe based on what our sacred writings say.
Returning to that golden rule mentality. Ambassador Regibo, I want to allow you to offer your thoughts on what we need to change and reform, but I also want to start down this conversation of feelings and speech that Ambassador Lambrinidis talked about, because you all have approached these concepts differently than we have in the United States, where we have a sort of more absolutist approach to free speech, where we don't have hate speech laws, and likely couldn't have hate speech laws under our Constitution. But a lot of other liberal democracies have a different approach to that. And when you take into account social media and new technologies and the spreading of both the spreading of hate, but also the ability to democratize the microphone for marginalized communities, there's another layer of conversation there. And so I guess I'm curious your thoughts on what changes we need to make to the earlier question, but also your thoughts on that balancing of speech, free speech and hate speech, and how we tackle that in the context of social media. And I'm going to also ask you that question.
So that's exactly one of the topics I wanted to mention. Also, maybe by starting to say a few words just about me and my father. My father was a partisan in World War II. He fought against Nazism. As a result, he spent 3 years in a Nazi concentration camp. So you can imagine that was an experience that changed his life. He was freed by the 7th U.S. Army in Dachau, 1945. And you know, that's where we have some paradox. Because in Belgium, if anybody wants to buy the book by Hitler, it's simply forbidden. In Belgium, you cannot find a book by Hitler, because for us, it's hatred. But you can find it in the United States, which is just amazing to us, because Hitler is the symbol of everything we want to oppose. It's the destruction. It's against humanity. It's against human dignity. And sometimes we are really struck by this type of situation. And then you mentioned also the media, in particular the social media. And I think that there are two aspects that are really a bit surprising for old Europe, if you want. First is the reasoning that the social media are just the medium and that they should be allowed not to judge the content. But you know, in Europe, newspapers, they are judged every single day on the content of what they publish, because they do have a responsibility in what lives in the community. And so we do have laws against excess also in newspapers. But we do have also a guarantee when there is something wrong in the press, because we believe the press and the freedom of expression to be so important, then it is a special court that will take a decision. And so, and everything public, of course, so that it's for all to see what's going on and what the person is accused of, and it will also be a public jury to take the decision. That's the first point. The second point is, and we found it very dangerous on social media, is you can write whatever you want anonymously. You do not even own up to what you're writing, so that you encourage people to write any type of fantasies and to renounce any type of social responsibility. This I really find amazing. If at least you want to say something negative, at least you have to take responsibility for what you say, but not so on social media. It's very difficult to find out who has written such a piece. And so if you just cancel the anonymous aspect and you force people to take responsibility for their act, but also for what they say, you could change a lot of things. Thank you.
Congresswoman.
So this is such an important conversation to put at the tail end, because, you know, there's a difference between free speech and hate speech. And in our country, there is responsibility. You can't yell fire in a building. There are things that are protected. And I think also one of the challenges, there are a couple things. Number one, social media companies and platforms do need to be held to account. And it's funny because this is actually something that Democrats and Republicans in our country actually are having conversations in Congress and agree on. I got a chance to visit members of the EU pre-pandemic, and we had a lot of conversation about privacy as well. And what, you know, GDPR and things that you do that are different than we do, and things that we can adopt that would also help businesses across the world to be able to have some consistency. So there are things that sometimes, you know, seem kind of black and white, but that they aren't. But I go back to this issue of fear and weaponizing it, because, and back to the issue of inequality. I feel that inequality, when somebody says, what difference does it make when I vote? It's because they don't feel a connection to what it is that we do, and we're not helping make that connection. And I feel fear is the thing that is being weaponized, because I'm afraid of you because you're going to take my job. I'm afraid of you because you're going to take money. It's going to cost me money to give you money. I'm afraid of you because you're going to take away my privilege. And sometimes the reason why we have laws is because, as Dr. King said, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something about the fact that sort of, if your heart won't catch up, we're going to make sure there are some laws in place to protect people. And then maybe through the practice of those laws, people's hearts can change. But I think that this is such an important conversation. I think it's important to have it globally, because what we're experiencing here has been multiplied and is happening around the globe in terms of lack of confidence in institutions like the media, like our Congress. These are intentional in some ways. And again, it goes back to that fear and trying to maintain power. But the reality is the world is changing and is shifting, and just look at the demographics. The demographics show it. And I think that causes fear for people as well. So back to love. I totally agree. I said you're speaking my language, because it is hard to love people you don't like. But that's what we're called to do. And I remember a few weeks ago sitting in a committee hearing on my Energy and Commerce Committee, and feeling that the other side of the aisle was saying things that had nothing to do with what we were talking about. We're talking about educating kids and giving them tablets, and they bring up critical race theory. What does that have to do with this bill? We were talking, I mean, I could go through examples, and I literally had to call my sister. I text my sister and my daughter and said, pray for me right now, because I'm starting to not feel like myself. And I think that's the problem with this moment as well. The mental health stress on all of us is compounding this. And I literally had to pray. I opened up a Bible app, and it was about loving people. How can you love God, who you can't see, and not love people that are right in front of your face or right across the aisle? This is about love, and that is hard work. And as Pat Benatar said, love is a battlefield. So we just got to do our job.
So on that note, I don't know if you want to add to what was previously.
We're wrapping up, right?
Yep.
So can I just say something on this?
Yes.
Because you wanted us to be specific.
Yes.
So I'll say three specific things. One thing we have to do in Europe and in the United States is we have to look at the way that the algorithms that weaponize hate in social media work. it's a specific thing. Democracy needs defending, guys. It's not going to survive. It's a fragile system. We have to work on it every day. And when a system is designed that the more I click on something, the more money someone makes, in our economies, where those industries are really, really powerful economically, then you can bet you that, you know, the encouragement will be to click more. And what unfortunately will click more is in things that incite us, that get us excited. It's not going to be so much the love stuff, right? Unless it's a puppy. I guess the puppies and the cats and stuff get all clicks. Okay, so that's one thing. And that's hard work because it's not like it's obvious and because we're all fanatically protective of freedom of expression. But as you said, you cannot, indeed, you cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. That's what I was taught the first day, my first day in law school here in the US. So it's not like, but okay, it's hard work. Second thing we got to do is, second thing we do in Europe is, I cannot comment about the United States, is we have determined that to fight inequalities in our societies, we cannot allow the markets to do everything on themselves. And there are some things that are so fundamental rights, health, education, retirement, that our taxes have to pay for. And that's because if you're rich, you pay more taxes, you're poor, you pay fewer taxes. Whether you're rich or poor, you have an interest in a society that is fair and peaceful as opposed to one that can break apart. And so we have free education in Europe, from nursery school to university. You also have private education you can pay for, but if you can't do that, in every one of our countries you can do that. You don't have to fight or beg to have a job in order to have health care because you get health care. And you know something, guys? And this is a big deal. You know how much, because everyone says, oh, that's Europe, you know, just look at them, you know, with all their pinko ideas about doing their side to side. Seriously? You know how much it costs in Europe to make sure that every single person in Europe, 450 million people, about 150 million more than the Americans, every single person gets free health? Costs our governments about $10,000 a year per person. You know how much it costs you here to give health care to not everyone? $15,000 on average. So you tell me, who's the better free market, open market, you know, person here, okay? So the second thing I would say is this. You got to look at this. Okay, final thing I would say. We have to protect our institutions, our checks and balances, because that's what our democracy is about. Any democracy is about that. John Arthur is absolutely right. Ballot box, the beginning of democracy, not the end. In many countries, you don't have the ballot box, so we got to fight to get those ballot boxes. But once you vote, that's the beginning, okay? So, oh boy, when I was traveling around the world, I had so many dictators, authoritarians, when I was doing human rights. When every other argument failed, they would turn to me and say, who are you to talk? Who are you to talk, Mr. Lambrinidis? Don't you have racism in Europe? Look at the migrants. Look at this. The implication was not, well, no one is perfect, therefore let's try together to become more perfect. The implication was, look, leave me alone. You have problems, I have problems, just let me repress my people. Now, first of all, absolutely correct, true. No one is perfect in human rights. But the fact that no one is perfect doesn't mean that we therefore are all equally imperfect. But most important, my answer was, you know who I feel I am to talk with all humility? If the litmus test for civil rights, human rights were perfection, no one passes it. But the litmus test is not perfection. The test is, do you have the independent institutions in place in your country that will ensure that if you violate rights, your feet will be on the coal? Do you have free civil society organizations that you don't throw in jail? You may disagree with them, but you don't throw in jail. You let them. Do you have free parliaments where people can disagree, people elected people can disagree, again, point out to what they think is an injustice or what they think is not an injustice, but shine the spotlight. Do you have a free press?
Do you allow people to come to church or to a mosque or to a synagogue, or, you know, to take the social actions that you take, Bishop, in this community? You know, someone else taking other actions. Do you allow them to do it, or do you actually repress freedom of religion or belief? Now, do you have free courts? When we in Europe look at our member states or others and we see a danger in our courts, that's a big red flashing light. Because if we lose that check and balance, boy, the slippery slope to authoritarianism, it's right there. So these are the three things I would say, concretely, that we have to do.
Well, that's a good path forward for us as we end this conversation, and I so appreciate everyone's time, both the American delegation and the delegation from the European Union. I think this conversation for me has reinforced, one, the foundation of love in all of this, but two, how much of this is an ecosystem, how you can't have human rights without democracy, how you can't have democracy without human rights, and that our institutions need to be there to help to facilitate and preserve those values. So thank you very much, ambassadors, for joining us at this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful church. And Bishop, thank you so much for hosting us this afternoon. And President Allen.
Boy, I think you got enough Europeans for a year. Yeah. Right?